There is a rock at the southern tip of Europe. It rises 426 meters above the sea, visible from Morocco on a clear day. It stands at the exact point where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, where Europe ends and Africa begins, where the ancient world called the edge of the known earth. The Romans called it Mons Calpe, one of the pillars of Hercules, the boundary beyond which nothing was supposed to exist. Today the world calls it Gibraltar, and Gibraltar is named after a man, Jabal Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq, named for the Berber general who crossed the narrow sea with 7,000 men in April 711 CE and made that rock his foothold for the conquest of an entire continent. His name was Tariq ibn Ziyad, and what he did in the 12 months after he landed on that rock is one of the most extraordinary military achievements in human history. And a continent changed, a civilization was born, and 1,300 years later, the rock still carries his name. This is his story. To understand what Tariq walked into, you must first understand what Spain was in 711 CE. The Iberian Peninsula had been ruled for 3 centuries by the Visigoths, a Germanic people who had swept into Spain as the Western Roman Empire collapsed. They were Christian. They were warrior aristocrats. They had built a kingdom that stretched from the Pyrenees in the north to the southern coast, a kingdom of cities and churches and ancient Roman roads and centuries of accumulated civilization. But in 711, the Visigothic kingdom was tearing itself apart. King Roderick had seized the throne through a violent coup. He had deposed the previous ruling family, the sons of King Witiza, and made bitter enemies of everyone loyal to them. He was fighting a war in the north against the Basques, while the south seethed with resentment. He had alienated the Jewish population of Spain through decades of persecution and forced conversion. He had ground the peasantry, the Hispano-Roman majority, under a boot of taxes and legal discrimination. His kingdom was a structure that looked solid from the outside and was rotting from within. And on the North African shore, an ambitious military commander was watching. Musa ibn Nusayr was the Umayyad governor of North Africa. Under his command, the armies of Islam had swept across the entire Maghreb, from Egypt to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. He had converted the Berber tribes to Islam and forged them into one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. He was looking north. He was looking at Spain. The invitation came from an unexpected direction. Julian, the Count of Ceuta, was a Visigoth nobleman who controlled the strategic fortress at the very tip of North Africa opposite Gibraltar. He had, as was the custom, sent his daughter Florinda to be educated at the court of King Roderick. The accounts of what happened there are consistent. Roderick violated her. Julian's response was cold and total. He came to Musa ibn Nusayr. He offered his ships. He offered his knowledge of the Spanish coast. He offered his hatred of Roderick as a military asset. He told Musa of the kingdom's weakness, the civil war, the unpopular king, the oppressed peasantry, yet the Jews who would welcome invaders who treated them fairly. Musa listened. He sent a reconnaissance mission under a commander named Tariq ibn Maluk in 710. 500 men who landed briefly on the Spanish coast, seized some plunder, and returned with a detailed report. The coast was undefended. The kingdom was weak. The prize was real. He turned to his best general, Tariq ibn Ziyad. Almost nothing is known for certain about Tariq's early life. The medieval sources disagree on his origins. Some say Berber from what is now Algeria. Some say Arab. Some say he was a freed slave who had risen to command through ability alone. What the sources agree on is what he was: a military commander of extraordinary skill, absolute personal courage, and the kind of calm intelligence that keeps its head in chaos. Musa had appointed him governor of Tangier after its conquest. That appointment itself was a signal. Tangier was the most strategically important city in North Africa. The man who governed it controlled the crossing to Europe. In late April 711 CE, Tariq crossed. He had 7,000 men, mostly Berber converts to Islam, some Arab veterans. The ships were Julian's merchant vessels. Civilian transport, not warships. They crossed the narrow strait in stages. The sea between Africa and Europe is only 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest, and landed at the great rock that would carry Tariq's name forever. He established his position at the rock. He sent scouts. He sent word to Musa requesting reinforcements. Musa sent 5,000 more men, bringing Tariq's total force to approximately 12,000. And then, according to the tradition that has echoed through history for 13 centuries, Tariq ordered the ships burned. The burning of the ships is disputed by historians. The earliest source that mentions it was written over 400 years after the event. The first Arabic accounts of the conquest do not include it. Some scholars believe it never happened, or happened differently, or was the ships being moved rather than destroyed. But whether the ships burned or not, the speech that followed them is recorded. Tariq stood before his army on Spanish soil with the sea behind them and the enemy ahead and said, "O people, where is the escape? The sea is behind you and the enemy before you. You have nothing but your swords and your courage. Whether the ships burned or not, that was the reality. 12,000 men on a hostile shore, with the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe assembling against them. No retreat possible in any practical sense. No reinforcements close enough to matter. Forward or nothing." King Roderick received word of the landing from the north where he was fighting the Basques. He turned south immediately. He assembled his army with the speed of a man who understood the threat, pulling forces from across his kingdom, calling the loyalty of his nobles, marching south through the heat of the Spanish summer. The numbers the sources give for his army vary enormously, from 25,000 to 100,000. The most credible modern estimates suggest approximately 33,000 to 40,000 men. Roderick commanded significantly more soldiers than Tariq. He was fighting on his own soil. He had the advantages of supply, terrain knowledge, and a defending army's natural advantage. He also had a fatal problem embedded in the center of his own army. The sons of Witiza, the family Roderick had deposed, were there. Their supporters were there. They were present in the battle not as loyal soldiers, but as men waiting for the right moment to betray the king who had taken their inheritance. Tariq knew this. His intelligence was good. He understood the division running through the Visigothic army before the battle began. The two armies met in mid-July 711 CE near the Guadalete River in the south of Spain, in the province now called Cadiz. The exact site remains disputed. What is not disputed is what happened. The battle lasted 8 days, 8 days of fighting. A grinding, sustained engagement rather than a single dramatic clash. Tariq held his smaller force together through extraordinary discipline and personal leadership. He was at the front. His commanders held their positions. Then the moment came. The sons of Witiza's commanders, positioned on Roderick's flanks, turned their forces and left the field. Whether this was prearranged with Tariq or simply opportunistic betrayal of a king they hated, the result was the same. Roderick's flanks collapsed. His center was exposed. His numerical advantage evaporated when a third of his army stopped fighting. Tariq drove his cavalry directly into the exposed center. Roderick was killed. The last Visigothic king of Spain died on the banks of the Guadalete River, and his army dissolved around his body. There was no organized retreat. There was no second line of defense. There was no rallying point. In the kingdom that the Visigoths had held for 3 centuries died on that battlefield in a single afternoon. What followed was not a conquest, it was more like a collapse. Without Roderick, the Visigothic kingdom had no center, no one to organize resistance, no one with the authority to call the armies of the north-south. The cities of Spain opened their gates. Tariq divided his 12,000 men into 4 columns and sent them in different directions simultaneously. One column took Córdoba, the greatest city in Spain. Another took Granada. Another took Malaga. Tariq himself marched on Toledo, the Visigothic capital. Toledo surrendered without fighting. The capital of 3 centuries of Visigothic rule opened its gates to a Berber general who had crossed the sea with borrowed ships 11 weeks earlier. In city after city, the Jewish population, who had lived under decades of persecution, forced conversion, and legal oppression under the Visigoths, opened the gates and welcomed the Muslim army. The Hispano-Roman peasantry, the majority of Spain's population, watched with something close to indifference as their Germanic rulers were replaced. They had never been treated as equal citizens of the Visigothic kingdom. The new rulers offered them better terms. By the end of 711 CE, less than 8 months after landing, Tariq controlled more of Spain than anyone who had invaded it since Julius Caesar. Musa ibn Nusayr arrived in 712 CE with 18,000 additional troops. He was both proud of and furious with his subordinate. According to some accounts, he had Tariq briefly imprisoned, angry that his general had exceeded his orders and conquered an entire kingdom without waiting for permission. The 2 men eventually reconciled and campaigned together, taking Seville, Merida, Zaragoza, Barcelona, and pushing north until the armies of Islam stood at the foothills of the Pyrenees looking into France. By 715 CE, 2/3 of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control. Spain had fallen faster than Rome had, faster than the Visigoths themselves had taken it, faster than any subsequent power would ever conquer it again. In 714 CE, Caliph Al-Walid I summoned both Musa and Tariq to Damascus. They came. They were honored. The caliph died in 715. His successor, Caliph Suleiman, had no use for either of them. Both were stripped of their positions. Both were accused of taking plunder that belonged to the caliphate. Musa was imprisoned. Tariq, the man who had given Iraq to history, whose name was carved permanently into European geography, faded into the background of the Umayyad court. He died in Damascus around 720 CE, in obscurity, with nothing. The man who had conquered Spain died without ceremony in the city that owned him. The caliph who summoned him back had taken everything he built and given him nothing in return. His name survives. The rock survives. Gibraltar survives. The man does not. What Tariq built lasted 750 years. The civilization that grew from his crossing was called Al-Andalus. At its height, it was the most advanced civilization in Europe, not by a small margin, by a vast one, while the rest of Europe lived through what historians call the Dark Ages. When literacy collapsed, trade ceased, cities emptied, and knowledge was lost, Al-Andalus was building. Córdoba became the largest city in Europe with over 1 million inhabitants. Its library contained 400,000 books at a time when the largest library in Christian Europe had perhaps 400. Its physicians were performing surgeries that European doctors would not attempt for another 4 centuries. Its astronomers were mapping stars. Its philosophers were preserving the works of Aristotle and Plato that Europe had lost and would not rediscover for centuries more. A Christian historian writing in the 10th century described Córdoba as a city that held the torch of learning and civilization bright and shining before the Western world, while all of Europe was plunged in barbaric ignorance and strife. That civilization began with a crossing. with 7,000 men and a narrow sea, with a speech on a shore that said, "The sea is behind you and the enemy before you." What is the lesson of Tariq ibn Ziyad? Not the tactics, not the battle, not even the conquest. The lesson is what happens when a man refuses to give himself a retreat option. The burning of the ships, whether literal or legendary, is one of the most powerful strategic concepts in the history of warfare. Bound when there is no way back, when retreat is not available as an option, the human mind focuses with a clarity that comfortable soldiers never achieve. Every calculation simplifies. Every decision becomes easier. You move forward or you cease to exist. Tariq crossed the sea with 7,000 men. The largest kingdom in Western Europe stood before him. He was on their soil. He had no fortress. He had no supply line. He had no reinforcements within reach. He had his men. He had his faith. He had his sword. And he had the understanding that the sea behind him made the enemy in front the only direction worth thinking about. 12 months later, he had given a continent a new civilization. The rock still carries his name, Gibraltar, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. 1,300 years, and it has never been renamed. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to History Rise, because history this powerful deserves to be told.